One of my favorite analogies is this idea of the stomach tumor demonstration. So the suggestion is that it may not be obvious how to solve a problem, but if we could come up with an analogy in a completely unrelated domain, it tends to lend itself to illustration, even if it's not brought to our attention at first. Although, as your author says, many participants are slow to be brought to that realization. So here's the idea. There's a person with an inoperable stomach tumor and rays that destroy organic tissue at sufficient intensity. By what procedure can one free him of the tumor by these rays and at the same time avoid destroying the healthy tissue that surrounds it? And as a 54-year-old off and on patient myself with this sort of situation, not in the stomach but somewhere else, my doctors have dealt with this very situation, and so far I've had a lot of luck. I've been very lucky. But one suggestion would be, and here's some basically some recommendations: send rays through the esophagus, desensitize the healthy tissues by means of some kind of injection, expose the tumor by operating, etc. So there are a lot of ways to do it. But the bottom line is, and here's a classic illustration. Let me pull this up. That what we ultimately have to do, I should have had this pulled up. I'm terribly sorry. That was a little out to lunch there. Is, and you'll see on the right here, have sufficient strength from a number of beams so that no one beam is doing a lot of damage to tissue that needs to be preserved. No, on the left, of course, that wouldn't meet that bill. There's too much strength in one beam, and that damages the good tissue. So I must essentially divide and conquer and come at it from several different angles. So now this would be much different than some of the foolhardy recommendations that are offered here, that are completely misplaced and not adequate by your author's standards. So these authors, and this is fairly recent for this chapter, 1980, presented participants with this sort of problem. And Dunker has made a few problems like this. And after each person had read a story such as the one in box 11.4, although the story appeared very dissimilar to the tumor problem, the underlying method of solution was the same. They found that participants who had read the story of the general and were told that it contained a relevant hint were more likely to solve the problem than participants who simply read it and didn't get a hint. So here it is. Go with me on this. It's a little bit lengthy, but as you can see, it draws on the same principle. A country was ruled by a dictator. The fortress was situated in the middle of the country, surrounded by farms and villages. Many roads led to the fortress through the countryside. A rebel general vowed to capture the fortress. The general knew that an attack by his entire army would beat that fortress. He gathered his army at the head of one of the roads, ready to launch an attack. However, this general learned that the dictator had planted mines on each of the roads. The mines were set so that small bodies of men could pass over them safely, since the dictator needed to move his troops and workers to and from the fortress. However, any large force going down one road would detonate these mines. So not only would this blow up the road, but it would also destroy the neighborhood villages, which we don't want, of course. So the general devised a plan. He divided his army into small groups and dispatched each group to the head of a different road. And when everything was ready, he gave the signal, and each group marched down a different road in such a force that it was too light to set off the mines. So each group continued down its road to the fortress, so that the entire army arrived together at the fortress at the same time. And this way it captured the fortress and overthrew that dictator. So, you may think that's pretty rudimentary, but it's amazing that not everyone that read this story picked up on it and applied it to the tumor problem. You would think they were directly analogous, but it is a point of fact that it needed to be pointed out to some people. So here's the idea. Only 30% of participants spontaneously recognized that analogy, without nudging, without being given a hint. However, the point was adopted without nudging if more than one analogy was used. So if I could present another story in which there was dividing and conquering, then people would basically have a way of going about it, if you will. So they would pick up on the idea and use the divide and conquer notion with the tumor. And of course, that's an oversimplification of what can be done with cancerous tumors, but nonetheless, that's the idea. So it's kind of an interesting idea. How often do we reason by analogy of dividing and conquering or other things? People are always using analogies like fighting. There's so many things like in debate. I'll give you an example, perfect one. In 1974, you probably heard of Muhammad Ali, who was at that time age 32 and had aged a lot, was fighting 24-year-old George Foreman. And George Foreman was as big as Muhammad Ali was. Foreman was much larger, 40 pounds heavier, and had much more punching strength. And he was heavily favored over Muhammad Ali, 8-1 favorite. And what Muhammad Ali did as part of a strategy was not throw very many punches in that fight and waited for Foreman to tire himself out. And he came back and prevailed, Ali did, in the 8th round. So that strategy was called a quote-unquote rope-a-dope. He laid on the ropes and let Foreman tire himself out and eventually came back and won. One of the greatest upsets in boxing history. And we here at SFA love George Foreman, by the way. We were huge fans of him and Nacogdoches also. I hope I'm not breaking any rules, but one of his children actually went to school here. So people often use that analogy of rope-a-dope insofar that they're going to let an opponent exhaust their arsenal, tire themselves out and rebound sharply at an end once they've depleted themselves, is the idea. So you hear these sorts of fight analogies all the time. And people are often reasoning by analogy, as corny as that may have sounded. So I know not everybody's a boxing fan, and 1974 was 50 years ago. It'll be October 1st is the anniversary, I think. But you hear these analogies all the time, and people reason through those things with debates or arguments on the floor of Congress or what have you.